When I walked into my kitchen that Tuesday evening and found Harold's divorce papers spread across my dining table, I couldn't help but laugh. What my husband of 37 years didn't know was that I had filed for divorce that very morning, at the Willowbrook County Courthouse. While he was sneaking around thinking he was about to blindside me, I had already beaten him to the punch by 8 hours. But that wasn't even the biggest shock he had coming. Harold had no idea that his simple housewife, Eleanor, was actually Eleanor Blackwood-Montgomery, sole heir to the Montgomery Steel fortune and owner of the very company where he'd been embezzling funds for the past 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Eleanor Blackwood-Montgomery, though for nearly 4 decades I've been known simply as Eleanor Henshaw to everyone in our small town of Millfield Creek. I'm 72 years old, and up until this morning, I was playing the role of a devoted wife to Harold Henshaw, a 68-year-old man who thought he'd married a nobody from nowhere. The truth is quite different. I am the only daughter of the late industrial magnate, Charles Montgomery, founder of Montgomery Steel Industries, one of the largest steel production companies in the northeastern United States. When my father passed away 15 years ago, I inherited everything: the company, the real estate, portfolio, the offshore accounts, the whole empire. But Harold knew none of this. Why the deception, you might ask? Well, when I met Harold 39 years ago at a church social in the neighboring town of Oakville, I was a 43-year-old woman who had been burned by fortune hunters one too many times. After my first husband died in a car accident, leaving me a widow at 35, I'd experienced firsthand how quickly people's attitudes changed when they discovered the Montgomery name and what came with it. I wanted to find someone who would love Eleanor the person, not Eleanor the heiress. So when I moved to Millfield Creek for a fresh start, I took my mother's maiden name, Blackwood, and kept my wealth a carefully guarded secret. I bought a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street under an alias, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and shopped at thrift stores. To everyone in town, including Harold, I was just Eleanor Blackwood, a quiet woman with a small inheritance from a deceased aunt that allowed me to live simply but comfortably. Harold was different from the men I'd known in my wealthy circles. He was genuine, hard-working, and seemed to love me for who I was, not what I could provide. He worked as an accountant at what he didn't know was one of my subsidiary companies, Millfield Manufacturing, a small steel parts supplier. When we married 2 years later, I was convinced I'd found true love at last. For 37 years, I played my role perfectly. I clipped coupons, worried about grocery bills, and let Harold believe he was our family's primary provider. I watched him proudly tell people how he took care of his wife, how he was the breadwinner. It was a comfortable lie that seemed to make us both happy. But comfortable lies have a way of unraveling, especially when the person you're lying for starts taking advantage of your trust. It all began to fall apart 6 months ago when I noticed subtle changes in Harold's behavior. He started working late more frequently, claiming the company was going through a busy period. He became secretive about his phone, taking calls in the garage or stepping outside when certain numbers appeared on the screen. Most tellingly, he started talking about our financial limitations more often, suggesting we needed to be even more careful with money. This struck me as odd because I knew exactly how much Harold made. After all, I technically owned the company that employed him. His salary was decent for our area, and our modest lifestyle shouldn't have required such penny pinching. When he started mentioning that we might need to consider selling our house to afford my prescription medications in our golden years, I knew something was seriously wrong. You see, Harold didn't know that I was already taking care of our financial future. For 37 years, I'd been quietly funneling money into accounts that would provide for both of us in retirement. I'd purchased long-term care insurance, set up medical trusts, and ensured that we'd never want for anything. But I couldn't tell him this without revealing my true identity. So instead, I did what any suspicious wife would do. I started paying attention. That's when I discovered Harold's affair with Constance Wilkins, the 38-year-old divorced secretary, from his office. But it wasn't just an affair. It was a full-blown financial conspiracy. Through my connections at Montgomery Steel, I was able to access information that revealed Harold had been systematically embezzling money from Millfield Manufacturing for the past 3 years. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as he grew bolder. The money wasn't just funding his midlife crisis romance with Constance. Harold had been telling her that he was trapped in a marriage with a financially dependent, older woman, me, and that he was working hard to build a nest egg so they could start fresh together. He'd painted himself as a devoted husband, sacrificing his happiness to care for his poor, helpless wife. The irony was delicious. Harold was stealing money from a company I owned to fund an escape plan from a wife who could buy and sell everything he'd ever dreamed of owning. But the final straw came last week when I overheard him on the phone with Constance, discussing their plan to divorce me and take half of what he believed to be our modest assets. He was actually worried about having to pay me alimony from his accountant's salary. The conversation I overheard made it clear that he planned to present me with divorce papers this week, expecting me to be devastated and financially helpless. Harold had no idea that I'd been several steps ahead of him for months. While he was planning his great escape, I was documenting his embezzlement, gathering evidence of his affair, and preparing for the most satisfying reveal of my lifetime. That's why, at 9 a.m. this Tuesday morning, I walked into the Willowbrook County Courthouse and filed for divorce first. By the time Harold came home with his dramatic announcement and his stack of papers, I was already legally ahead of him in ways he couldn't even imagine. But this story isn't just about beating my cheating husband to the courthouse. It's about what happened when Harold realized that the helpless elderly woman he thought he was discarding actually held all the cards and had been holding them for 37 years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. To understand how I managed to keep my true identity hidden for 37 years, you need to know what my daily life in Millfield Creek actually looked like. Every morning, I would wake up at 6 a.m. in our modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, make Harold his coffee in our outdated kitchen with the chipped Formica countertops, and send him off to work with a packed lunch in a brown paper bag. Our house was deliberately unremarkable. A 200-square-foot ranch built in 1967, with beige carpeting that had seen better days and furniture I'd carefully selected from estate sales and discount stores. The most expensive item in our home was Harold's reclining chair, which I'd splurged on for his 60th birthday, making a big show of saving up for months to afford the $400 purchase. What Harold didn't know was that 3 towns over, in the prestigious Hillcrest Heights district, I owned a sprawling 15,000-square-foot mansion that had been my childhood home. The Montgomery estate sat on 40 acres of pristine land, complete with a private lake, tennis court, and guest houses. I'd kept the property maintained through a management company, visiting only when Harold believed I was going to my book club meetings or volunteering at the church in Oakville. The irony of my double life wasn't lost on me. While Harold counted every penny and lectured me about turning off lights to save on electricity, I was secretly maintaining a household staff at the Montgomery estate. Mrs. Patricia Holloway, my housekeeper of 20 years, would often ask when I planned to stop playing house in that dreadful little town. I always told her the same thing, when the game stopped being worth playing. My financial arrangements were more complex than most people could imagine. The bulk of my wealth was held in trusts and offshore accounts that Harold could never have discovered even if he'd tried. But I also maintained what I called my Eleanor Blackwood accounts, carefully managed funds that supported our modest lifestyle without raising suspicions. Every month, I would receive what Harold believed was a small pension check from my deceased aunt's estate. In reality, This was a carefully orchestrated transfer from one of my investment accounts, designed to provide exactly the amount needed for our simple living expenses. I had become a master of financial theater, making $3,000 a month seem like our entire income when I was actually earning more than that in interest every single day. The most challenging part of maintaining my cover wasn't the money, it was the social aspects. Millfield Creek was a small town where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. I had to become Eleanor Blackwood, the quiet widow who'd moved to town with a small inheritance and was grateful to find love again, with Harold Henshaw. I joined the Millfield Creek Methodist Church, volunteered at the annual pie sale, and participated in the women's auxiliary meetings. I learned to speak differently, adopting the local dialect and avoiding the refined speech patterns that had been drilled into me at the private schools I'd attended. I shopped at Bargain Mart instead of the boutiques I'd once frequented, and I became genuinely skilled at finding good deals and stretching a dollar. But perhaps the most elaborate part of my deception involved my job. Harold believed I worked part-time as a bookkeeper for small local businesses, which explained why I was sometimes away during the day and had a modest income of my own. In reality, I was running Montgomery Steel Industries from a distance, conducting board meetings via secure video calls during my supposed work hours, and making million-dollar decisions from the spare bedroom Harold thought was my craft room. Assistant Jennifer Walsh was the only person who knew the full truth about my situation. She would call the house occasionally, identifying herself as Mrs. Johnson from the Henderson accounting firm, whenever Harold answered. These calls were actually briefings about company operations, stock performance, and strategic decisions that required my immediate attention. The technology required for this deception had evolved significantly over the years. What started with carefully timed phone calls in the 1990s had evolved into encrypted laptops, secure phones, and virtual meeting platforms that allowed me to participate in board meetings from my kitchen table while Harold was at work. I maintained this routine religiously. Harold would leave for Millfield Manufacturing at 7:30 a.m., and by 8 a.m., I would transform from Eleanor the housewife into Eleanor Montgomery, industrial executive. I would review financial reports, approve major expenditures, and make strategic decisions that affected thousands of employees across multiple states. Then, by 4:30 p.m., I would shut down my equipment, hide it in the false bottom of my hope chest, and return to preparing dinner for my hardworking husband. The psychological toll of living this double life had been significant, especially in recent years. There were times when I wanted to tell Harold everything, to share my real world with him, to stop pretending that a $20 dinner at Applebee's was a special treat when I could have taken him anywhere in the world. But I'd convinced myself that preserving his ego and our relationship was worth the sacrifice. Harold took such pride in being our provider. He would beam when neighbors complimented him on taking such good care of me, an older woman who had nothing when he married her. He genuinely believed he was my financial security, my protection against the world. In his mind, Eleanor Blackwood would be lost without Harold Henshaw's steady income and practical wisdom. This dynamic had worked for decades because I'd made it work. I'd swallowed my pride, bit my tongue, and played the grateful wife who appreciated every small kindness and financial gesture. When Harold surprised me with a $50 necklace from the local jewelry store, I gushed as if he'd given me the crown jewels. When he announced we could afford to eat out at the diner for our anniversary, I acted like he was treating me to a 5-star restaurant. But somewhere along the way, Harold's protectiveness had evolved into something else. He'd begun treating me not just as someone who needed his care, but as someone who was beneath him intellectually and socially. His comments about my simple ways and limited understanding of money had grown more frequent and more condescending. The man who'd once appreciated my contentment with simple pleasures had begun to resent what he saw as my lack of ambition. He'd started making comments about how other women their age were more worldly or more sophisticated. I realized that Harold had fallen out of love with Eleanor Blackwood. Not because she wasn't enough, but because he'd outgrown the fantasy of being her savior. What Harold didn't understand was that Eleanor Blackwood wasn't real. She was a character I'd been playing, a role I'd perfected over decades of careful performance. The real Eleanor, Eleanor Montgomery, was someone he'd never met, never known, and never appreciated. And now, as I prepared to let that character die and reveal my true self, I realized that the woman Harold was about to lose had never actually existed at all. The first crack in my carefully constructed world appeared on a rainy Thursday evening in March, exactly 8 months ago. Harold came home from work later than usual, claiming he'd had to stay behind to help train the new secretary. What struck me as odd wasn't the late arrival. It was the way he seemed almost energized by it. "This Constance Wilkins is really something," he said, hanging his damp coat in our front closet. "Sharp as a tack, that one. Picks things up faster than anyone I've seen in years." I was stirring a pot of beef stew on our ancient stove, but I turned to study Harold's face. In 37 years of marriage, I'd learned to read his expressions. Like a favorite book. There was something different in his eyes when he mentioned this Constance, a brightness that hadn't been there when he talked about work in years. "That's wonderful, dear," I replied carefully. "It must be nice to have competent help at the office." Harold nodded enthusiastically, perhaps too enthusiastically. "She's actually overqualified for the position, if you ask me. Has a degree in business administration from State University. Real go-getter type, nothing like—" He caught himself before finishing that sentence, but I heard the unspoken words anyway. "Nothing like you." Over the following weeks, Constance Wilkins became a frequent topic of conversation in our household. Harold would come home with stories about her innovative filing system, her suggestions for improving office efficiency, her insights into modern business practices. Each story felt like a small paper cut, individually insignificant, but collectively forming a pattern that made me increasingly uncomfortable. "Constance thinks we should digitize all the client files," Harold announced one evening in April. "She says the company is living in the Stone Age with all this paper documentation." I almost choked on my coffee. If only Harold knew that I'd been pushing for digital transformation across all Montgomery Steel subsidiaries for the past 5 years. The irony that he was now crediting this brilliant insight to his office secretary was almost too much to bear. But what really worried me wasn't Harold's professional admiration for Constance. It was the personal details that began creeping into his stories. How she brought homemade cookies to share with the office. How she stayed late to help him balance particularly challenging accounts. How she laughed at his jokes and sought his advice on everything from work matters to personal decisions. "Constance is having trouble with her ex-husband," Harold mentioned one evening in May. "Real piece of work, that guy. Left her practically destitute with a young son to raise. She's so brave trying to rebuild her life from scratch." The way Harold's voice softened when he talked about Constance's struggles set off every alarm bell. I recognized that tone. It was the same protective, nurturing voice he'd once used when talking about me in the early days of our marriage. Except now, Harold saw me as the woman who was taken care of, not the woman who needed his protection. I began paying closer attention to Harold's habits, and the changes were subtle, but unmistakable. He started showering immediately when he came, home from work, claiming the office air conditioning made him feel stuffy. He became particular about his appearance in ways he hadn't been in years, asking me to pick up specific brands of aftershave and hair gel during my shopping trips. Tellingly, Harold's attitude toward money began to shift. The man who had spent decades carefully budgeting every expense suddenly seemed less concerned about our modest finances. "Eleanor, I think we should increase the grocery budget a bit," he announced one Saturday morning in June. "Maybe try some of those fancier stores across town. Life's too short to pinch every penny." This from the man who had once made me return a $15 throw pillow because it wasn't practical enough for our budget. I also noticed that Harold had become secretive about his phone. For years, He'd answered calls on speaker, shared funny text messages, and left his phone lying around without a care. Now, he kept it face down during dinner, took it with him to the bathroom, and had developed a habit of stepping outside to get better reception when certain numbers called. The breaking point came on a sweltering July afternoon when I decided to surprise Harold with lunch at his office. I'd made his favorite sandwich, roast beef with the mustard he liked from the deli counter, and thought it would be a nice gesture to visit him at work for the first time in months. Millfield Manufacturing occupied a modest brick building on the industrial side of town. As one of my subsidiary companies, I knew its operations intimately, though Harold had no idea of my connection to his workplace. I'd deliberately kept my involvement in the company completely separate from his employment there. When I walked through the front door, carrying Harold's lunch in a small cooler bag, I expected to find him at his desk in the accounting department. Instead, I discovered Harold and Constance in the break room, sitting much closer together than two coworkers should be. They weren't doing anything overtly inappropriate, just talking quietly over coffee cups, but the body language was unmistakable. Harold was leaning toward her with an intimacy I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Constance, a petite, blonde woman who appeared to be in her late 30s, was looking up at Harold with an expression of rapt attention that made my stomach clench. What bothered me most wasn't just the obvious attraction between them, it was overhearing the conversation they were having. "The thing is, Connie," Harold was saying, using a nickname that sounded far too familiar, "Eleanor means well, but she just doesn't understand how the world works anymore. She's content with so little, you know? Sometimes I feel like I'm wasting my potential taking care of someone who doesn't even appreciate what I do for her." Constance placed her hand on Harold's arm in a gesture that was definitely not appropriate for a workplace conversation. "Harold, you're such a good man for staying loyal to her, but you deserve someone who challenges you, who shares your vision for the future. You're still young enough to have a real life with someone who truly appreciates your worth." I stood frozen in the doorway, Harold's lunch growing heavy in my hands. This wasn't just an affair brewing. This was Harold rewriting the narrative of our entire marriage. In his version of events, I was the burden he'd nobly shouldered, the simple woman who was holding back his potential for greatness. They still hadn't noticed me standing there. Harold sighed deeply and shook his head. "Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been like if I'd married someone more, I don't know, ambitious. Eleanor's a good woman, but she's never pushed me to be better. She's satisfied with our little life, our little house, our little dreams." "There's nothing wrong with wanting more," Constance said softly, "especially when you have so much to offer the right person." That's when I cleared my throat loudly. Both Harold and Constance jumped apart like teenagers caught by their parents. Harold's face went through several shades of red before settling on a sickly pale color. "Eleanor," he stammered, "what are you doing here?" I held up the lunch bag, with a smile that I hoped looked more genuine than it felt. "I thought I'd surprise you with lunch, dear, but I can see you're busy." Constance had the grace to look embarrassed, gathering her coffee cup and murmuring something about getting back to work. As she hurried past me, I got my first close look at the woman who was stealing my husband. She was attractive in a conventional way, with carefully styled hair and makeup that suggested she put considerable effort into her appearance. More importantly, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who believed she deserved better than what she currently had. The walk home from Millfield Manufacturing was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Harold's words echoed in my head. "She's satisfied with our little life, our little house, our little dreams." The cruel irony was that I had deliberately chosen this little life to make him happy, to protect his ego, to ensure that our love was real rather than transactional. But Harold didn't know that. In his mind, Eleanor Blackwood really was the simple, unambitious woman she appeared to be. And apparently, after 37 years, that woman was no longer enough for him. That evening, Harold was unusually quiet during dinner. He barely touched the pot roast I'd prepared and seemed lost in thought. When I asked about his day, he gave vague, non-committal answers. The easy conversation that had once flowed between us felt forced and awkward. As I watched Harold push food around his plate, avoiding eye contact, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in our marriage. The inciting incident wasn't just Harold's growing attachment to Constance. It was the moment I understood that my husband had fallen out of love with the woman I'd been pretending to be for nearly 4 decades. The question now was whether Eleanor Montgomery would let Eleanor Blackwood disappear quietly, or whether it was time for the real woman to finally stand up and fight for what was hers. After my unexpected visit to Harold's office, the atmosphere in our house became thick, with unspoken tension. Harold knew that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and I knew that my husband was emotionally involved with another woman, but neither of us addressed it directly. Instead, we began a careful dance around the truth that would last for months. Harold's first strategy was to overcompensate. The evening after my surprise lunch visit, he came home with a bouquet of grocery store flowers, the first flowers he'd brought me in over 2 years. "Just because," he said with forced cheerfulness, avoiding my eyes as he handed them over. "They're lovely, Harold," I replied, accepting the peace offering while studying his guilty expression. "What's the occasion?" "Can't a man buy his wife flowers without needing a reason?" he asked, but his laugh sounded hollow even to his own ears. Over. The following weeks, Harold seemed determined to prove that he was still a devoted husband. He complimented my cooking more frequently, offered to help with household chores without being asked, and even suggested we take a weekend trip to Branson to see the shows, something we hadn't done in 5 years. But his efforts felt mechanical, like he was following a script titled "How to Be a Good Husband," rather than expressing genuine affection. Worse still, his attempts at renewed romance were constantly interrupted by his obvious preoccupation with his phone and his continued late nights at the office. "Constance is implementing a new filing system," became Harold's standard explanation, "for working past 6 o'clock. It's a big project, and she needs someone experienced to guide her through the transition." I bit my tongue every time he said her name. What Harold didn't realize was that as the owner of Millfield Manufacturing, I received weekly reports on all major operational changes. There was no filing system overhaul happening at the company. Whatever Harold and Constance were doing during those extra hours, it wasn't work-related. My suspicions were confirmed when I decided to conduct my own investigation. One evening in late August, I told Harold I was attending a church committee meeting and instead drove to the Millfield Manufacturing parking lot. Sure enough, Harold's blue Ford pickup was parked next to a red Honda Civic that I assumed belonged to Constance. I waited in my car for 2 hours, watching the building. The lights in the accounting department stayed on long past normal business hours, but I saw no evidence of any intensive filing project. What I did see, through the partially open blinds, were 2 silhouettes sitting very close together at Harold's desk. When Harold finally emerged from the building at 9:30, he wasn't alone. Constance walked beside him to their cars, and before they parted ways, Harold pulled her into an embrace that lasted far longer than any professional goodbye should. I drove home in a fog of anger and heartbreak, arriving 20 minutes before Harold did. When he walked through our front door, I was waiting in the living room with a cup of tea, acting as if I'd been there all evening. "How was the committee meeting, dear?" he asked, his voice carefully casual. "Productive," I replied, matching his tone. "We discussed the upcoming fall festival. How was your evening at the office?" Harold's face flickered with something that might have been guilt before he settled into his rehearsed response. "Long but necessary. This filing project is more complex than we anticipated." That night, as Harold showered for the second time that day, I made a decision that would change everything. I retrieved my secure laptop from its hiding place and sent an encrypted message to Jennifer Walsh, my assistant at Montgomery Steel Industries. "I need a complete background check on Constance Marie Wilkins, employed at Millfield Manufacturing. I also need discreet surveillance of my husband, Harold Henshaw. Full financial audit of both individuals. This is personal, not business. Use the private investigation firm we've worked with before. Jennifer's response came within hours. Consider it done. How much detail do you want? Everything, I typed back. I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with. The report arrived 3 days later via secure courier, and what I discovered made Harold's betrayal even more devastating than I'd imagined. Constance Wilkins wasn't just any secretary looking for love. She was a woman with a very specific plan. According to the background check, Constance had a pattern. Over the past 10 years, she'd been involved with 3 different married men, all of them significantly older than herself, all of them in positions of financial responsibility at their companies. In each case, she'd positioned herself as the young, ambitious woman who understood and appreciated these men in ways their wives supposedly didn't. Her first target had been Robert Fleming, a bank manager in the neighboring town of Riverside. Constance had worked as a teller and had slowly convinced Robert that his wife was holding him back from his full potential. Robert eventually left his wife of 22 years and married Constance, only to discover that her expensive tastes and poor financial decisions had bankrupted him within 18 months. They divorced, and Robert lost his house, his savings, and his job due to some questionable loans that somehow traced back to Constance's influence. Her second victim was David Peterson, an insurance company executive from Oakville. Same pattern. Constance got hired as his assistant, slowly convinced him that his wife didn't appreciate his talents, orchestrated an affair, and eventually persuaded David to embezzle funds to support their future together. David ended up in prison for fraud, and Constance disappeared with the money before the investigation concluded. The third man, Thomas Bradley, had been smarter than the others. When Constance tried the same routine with him at his accounting firm, he recognized the pattern and fired her before she could do any real damage. But not before she'd managed to steal sensitive client information that she'd attempted to sell to competitors. Now she was in Millfield Creek, working at my company, targeting my husband, and Harold, bless his naive heart, thought he was her first great romance. But the most shocking revelation in the report wasn't about Constance's criminal history. It was about Harold's financial activities over the past 6 months. The private investigator had discovered that Harold had been systematically skimming money from Millfield Manufacturing's accounts. Small amounts at first, just a few $100s here and there, but recently the thefts had escalated to several $1,000s per month. The money wasn't going into Harold's personal checking account. Our modest lifestyle made that impossible to hide. Instead, he'd opened a secret account at a bank in the next county, an account that he was building up for what I could only assume was his planned escape with Constance. As I read through the financial documents, my hands shook with rage. My husband of 37 years wasn't just cheating on me emotionally. He was stealing from my company to fund his affair. He was literally using my money to betray me. The irony was so bitter I could taste it. Harold believed he was cleverly embezzling from his employer to build a nest egg for his new life. He had no idea that every dollar he stole was actually coming from his wife's fortune. In a twisted way, Harold was using my money to pay for his abandonment of me. But perhaps the most infuriating part of the whole situation was reading the investigators' notes about Harold and Constance's private conversations. They'd been careless about where they talked, and the investigator had managed to record several of their intimate discussions. In these conversations, Harold painted himself as a man trapped in a loveless marriage with an elderly woman who had no ambition or understanding of the modern world. He described me as a burden he'd carried out of duty, a simple housewife who would be lost without him, but who had never truly appreciated his sacrifices. Constance, for her part, played her role perfectly. She praised Harold's intelligence, his business acumen, his generous heart. She told him he deserved better than his current life, that he was wasting his potential on someone who couldn't match his sophisticated tastes and worldly knowledge. "Eleanor is lucky to have you," Constance had told him during one recorded conversation. "But she doesn't even realize what a catch she has. You need someone who can appreciate your mind, your ambition, your desire for something more than that little life you're living." Harold had eaten up every word of it. In his responses, I could hear him gradually convincing himself that leaving me would actually be an act of kindness, freeing us both from a marriage that had supposedly run its course. The final piece of evidence in the report was a photograph that made my blood run cold. Harold and Constance had been photographed at a jewelry store in the county seat, looking at engagement rings. According to the store clerk who'd been interviewed, Harold had explained that he was planning to propose to his girlfriend as soon as his divorce was finalized. The date on the photograph was from just 1 week ago. As I closed the investigative report and locked it away in my safe, I realized that Harold's betrayal was far more calculated and comprehensive than I'd initially understood. This wasn't a middle-aged man having a midlife crisis. This was a man who had systematically planned to abandon his wife, steal from his employer, and start a new life with a woman who was almost certainly going to destroy him financially and emotionally. The question now wasn't whether Harold was going to leave me. Based on the evidence, that decision had already been made. The question was whether I was going to let him blindside me with divorce papers, or whether Eleanor Montgomery was finally going to stop hiding and remind Harold Henshaw exactly who he'd chosen to betray. Armed with the devastating truth about Harold's betrayal and Constance's criminal history, I found myself facing an impossible choice. Every instinct screamed at me to confront Harold immediately, to throw the evidence in his face and watch him crumble under the weight of his exposed lies. But I forced myself to wait, to think strategically rather than emotionally. The hardest part wasn't knowing about Harold's affair. It was continuing to live with him as if nothing had changed. Every morning when he kissed my cheek goodbye, I had to resist the urge to tell him exactly what I knew about his secret bank account. Every evening when he came home with another lie about working late, I had to bite my tongue to keep from asking about Constance's latest manipulation. But perhaps the most excruciating part was watching Harold's transformation accelerate. The guilt-driven overcompensation that had marked his behavior in August gradually gave way to something much worse in September: barely concealed resentment. Harold began finding fault with everything I did. When I prepared his favorite dinner of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, he complained that the food was too heavy and suggested we should eat lighter, more sophisticated meals. When I wore the blue dress he'd once complimented, he mentioned that Constance had such a modern sense of style, and maybe I should update my wardrobe for our age. The criticisms were never direct enough to provoke an argument, but they were constant enough to make me feel like I was failing some test I didn't know I was taking. Harold had begun comparing me to Constance in subtle ways that made it clear I was coming up short in every category that mattered to him. Constance mentioned that she reads the Wall Street Journal every morning, Harold said one day over breakfast. She says it's important to stay informed about financial trends, even if you're not directly involved in investments. I almost laughed out loud. If Harold only knew that I'd been making investment decisions worth millions of dollars every week for the past 15 years. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully and said, "That sounds very responsible of her." "Maybe you should consider getting a subscription," Harold continued. "It might help you understand some of the conversations when we're out with other couples." The implication was clear. Eleanor Blackwood was too simple to follow adult conversations about money and business. Harold was becoming embarrassed by his wife's supposed intellectual limitations. But the psychological pressure wasn't just coming from Harold's growing disdain. I was also dealing with the mounting stress of maintaining my double identity while planning my counterstrike. Jennifer Walsh had begun sending me daily updates about Constance's activities, and what I learned made it clear that time was running out. Constance had started the process of infiltrating Harold's life completely. she'd convinced him to join her gym, suggesting they could work out together, since they both cared about staying healthy and attractive. She'd recommended restaurants where they could have business dinners to discuss office improvements. Most troubling, she'd begun asking Harold detailed questions about our home, our finances, and our future plans. According to the surveillance reports, Constance was now spending almost every evening with Harold under the pretense of various work projects. They'd been seen at coffee shops, restaurants, and even a weekend farmer's market, behaving like a couple who were well past the initial stages of their relationship. The financial theft was also escalating. In September alone, Harold had stolen over $8,000 from Millfield manufacturing accounts. The amounts were still small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits, but if he continued at this pace, he'd have accumulated nearly $50,000 by the end of the year, presumably enough to fund his divorce proceedings and a fresh start with Constance. What Harold didn't know was that as the owner of the company, I was receiving detailed reports about these discrepancies. My chief financial officer, Marcus Reed, had already flagged the irregularities and was preparing to launch a formal investigation into the accounting department's activities. "Mrs. Montgomery," Marcus had said during our encrypted phone call, "we're seeing systematic withdrawals from several client accounts. The amounts suggest someone with access to the accounting software is deliberately skimming funds. I recommend we bring in external auditors and notify law enforcement." I'd managed to delay the investigation by claiming I wanted to handle the matter internally first, but I knew I couldn't postpone it indefinitely. Harold was unknowingly racing against a clock that would soon expose his crimes to law enforcement, regardless of my personal feelings about our marriage. The pressure reached a breaking point in early October, when Harold made a request that revealed just how far his duplicity had progressed. "Eleanor," he said one evening, approaching me with the kind of careful tone people use when they're about to ask for a significant favor, "I've been thinking about our future, and I believe we need to have some serious conversations about our finances." I looked up from the book I was pretending to read, my heart rate spiking. "What kind of conversations, dear?" Harold sat down across from me, adopting what I recognized as his concerned husband expression. "Well, we're both getting older, and I think it's time we made some practical decisions about our assets. You know, estate planning, power of attorney arrangements, that sort of thing." The request was so audacious it took all my self-control not to laugh. Harold wanted me to sign legal documents that would give him control over what he believed to be our modest savings, not realizing that doing so would potentially give him access to one of the largest personal fortunes in the state. "What brought this on?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Constance mentioned that her ex-husband created a lot of problems for her during their divorce because she hadn't protected her assets properly," Harold explained, apparently oblivious to how inappropriate it was to cite his mistress as a source of marital advice. "I don't want us to face similar complications if something happens to one of us." The irony was staggering. Harold was using advice from a known con artist to manipulate his wife into signing away her financial independence, all while planning to divorce her and steal her money. And he was doing it with such earnest concern that I almost believed he thought he was acting in my best interests. "I suppose that makes sense," I said slowly. "What exactly are you proposing?" Harold pulled out a folder that I realized he'd prepared in advance. "I've drafted some basic documents that would streamline our financial management. Essentially, it would consolidate our accounts and designate me as the primary decision-maker for investments and major purchases." As he handed me the papers, I saw that they were far more comprehensive than he'd initially suggested. Harold wasn't just asking for power of attorney. He was asking me to sign documents that would effectively transfer ownership of all Eleanor Blackwood's assets to him immediately. "This seems quite extensive," I observed, flipping through pages of legal language that would have been intimidating to someone who wasn't already familiar with complex financial documents. "I know it looks complicated," Harold said with practiced sympathy, but it's really just protecting us both. This way, if anything happens to either of us, the survivor won't have to deal with probate courts and legal complications. What Harold was actually proposing was a complete financial takeover that would leave me with no independent resources when he filed for divorce. If I signed these documents, Eleanor Blackwood would become entirely dependent on Harold's goodwill for survival, making his eventual abandonment even more devastating. "I'll need some time to review these," I said, setting the papers aside. Harold's expression flickered with something that might have been impatience before settling back into concerned understanding. "Of course, take all the time you need. But, Eleanor, I hope you'll trust me on this. After 37 years, I think I've proven that I have your best interests at heart." That night, as Harold slept peacefully beside me, apparently unburdened by guilt over his systematic betrayal of everything our marriage had supposedly meant, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, processing the full scope of what he was attempting. Harold wasn't just planning to leave me for a younger woman. He wasn't just stealing money from my company to fund his affair. He was actively working to ensure that Eleanor Blackwood would be left completely helpless when he finally revealed his true intentions. In Harold's mind, he was probably convincing himself that he was being kind by setting up this elaborate scheme. After all, once he controlled my assets, he could decide how much money to leave me during the divorce, positioning himself as generous rather than calculating. But Harold had made one crucial miscalculation in his planning. He'd spent so many years thinking of Eleanor Blackwood as a simple, trusting woman that he'd forgotten to consider what might happen if she turned out to be someone else entirely. As I listened to my husband's peaceful breathing, I realized that the time for observation and patience was coming to an end. Harold had accelerated his timeline, and now I would have to accelerate mine. The question was no longer whether I would reveal my true identity. It was how dramatically I would choose to destroy the elaborate web of lies that Harold and Constance had built around their stolen romance. The breaking point came on a crisp October morning, when I discovered that Harold had already begun making decisions, as if the financial documents I hadn't yet signed were legally binding. I was reviewing our monthly bank statements, a habit I'd maintained for decades to keep track of our modest household expenses, when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Harold had withdrawn $1,500 from our joint checking account without discussing it with me. In 37 years of marriage, neither of us had ever made a withdrawal of more than $200 without consulting the other first. When I called the bank to inquire about the transaction, I was told that Harold had explained he needed the money for medical expenses for his wife. I hadn't had any medical expenses. I hadn't even been to the doctor in 6 months. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove directly to Millfield Manufacturing during Harold's work hours and observed the building from across the street. What I saw confirmed my worst suspicions about how Harold was spending our money. At exactly noon, Harold and Constance emerged from the building together. But instead of walking to the small diner where Harold usually ate his brown bag lunch, they got into Constance's red Honda and drove to Chez Laurent, the most expensive French restaurant in the county. I followed at a distance, watching as Harold, the man who had complained about spending $30 for our anniversary dinner just last year, escorted Constance into an establishment where a single meal easily cost what we supposedly budgeted for groceries in a week. Through the restaurant's large windows, I could see Harold and Constance at a corner table, sharing what appeared to be champagne and an elaborate lunch that included multiple courses. Harold was animated in a way I hadn't seen in years, gesturing expressively as he told stories that made Constance laugh and touch his arm affectionately. The scene was so different from our recent dinners at home, where Harold barely looked up from his phone and responded to my attempts at conversation with distracted grunts, that I felt like I was watching a stranger. This charming, attentive man paying for expensive champagne was the same person who had lectured me just last week about the unnecessary expense of buying name-brand cereal instead of the generic version. But what devastated me most wasn't the money Harold was spending on Constance. It was the realization that he was using our joint account to pay for it. Harold wasn't just stealing from my company to fund his affair. He was also stealing from what he believed to be our shared savings to wine and dine his mistress. The betrayal felt so complete, so calculated, that I sat in my car outside that restaurant and finally allowed myself to cry. For the first time, since this nightmare began, I grieved not just for my marriage, but for the years I'd wasted believing that Harold loved Eleanor Blackwood enough to build a simple, honest life with her. When I returned home that evening, Harold was already there, reading the newspaper in his recliner as if he'd spent his lunch hour eating a sandwich at his desk. The casual way he looked up and smiled when I walked in, as if he hadn't just spent my money on an intimate lunch with another woman, made me realize that Harold had become someone I no longer recognized. "How was your day, dear?" he asked, his tone so normal it seemed rehearsed. "Fine," I replied, settling into my usual chair across from him. "How was yours?" "Oh, the usual. Busy day at the office. Constance is really helping streamline our processes." Harold's ability to lie so smoothly while looking directly at me was more disturbing than anything else he'd done. That night, after Harold had gone to bed, I made the call that would change everything. I contacted my personal attorney, Victoria Stern, a woman who had been handling Montgomery family legal matters for over 20 years. "Victoria, I need to file for divorce," I said without preamble when she answered her private line. There was a long pause before Victoria responded. "Eleanor, I have to ask, does this have anything to do with your situation with Harold? I mean, does he know about your real identity?" "He has no idea," I confirmed, "and I want to keep it that way until the divorce is final. Is that possible?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, undoubtedly considering the complexities of representing a client whose spouse didn't know she was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "It's complicated, but yes, it can be done. We'll need to be very strategic about asset disclosure and timing." "Good. I also need you to coordinate with the fraud investigation at Millfield Manufacturing. Harold has been embezzling funds, and I want the criminal charges to be filed simultaneously with the divorce papers." "Eleanor," Victoria said carefully, "you realize that once this process begins, there's no going back. Harold will discover everything: your identity, your wealth, his mistake. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Harold's lies, about the champagne lunch, about the legal documents he'd tried to manipulate me into signing. I'm more than prepared. I want Harold to understand exactly what he's thrown away and exactly how stupid he's been. The next morning, while Harold was at work presumably planning his next expensive date with Constance, I drove to Victoria's office in the state capital to begin the legal process that would end my marriage and destroy Harold's carefully constructed plans. Victoria had prepared a comprehensive strategy that was both elegant and devastating. Rather than simply filing for divorce as Eleanor Blackwood, she had structured the proceedings to reveal my true identity at the most damaging possible moment for Harold. "We'll file the initial papers under your legal name, Eleanor Montgomery," Victoria explained, "but Harold won't receive them until after the criminal charges for embezzlement are filed. He'll be arrested first, and then while he's processing the criminal implications, he'll be served with divorce papers that reveal exactly who he's been stealing from." The criminal case was surprisingly straightforward, with the evidence my private investigator had gathered, plus the internal financial records from Millfield Manufacturing. The district attorney's office was eager to prosecute what they saw as a clear-cut case of employee theft. "Mrs. Montgomery," District Attorney Rebecca Walsh explained during our meeting, "your husband's embezzlement follows a pattern we've seen before in cases involving older employees who believe they're entitled to more than their salary provides. The amounts are significant enough to warrant felony charges." What made Harold's case particularly damaging was that the money trail clearly showed he'd been using the stolen funds for personal expenses that had nothing to do with his family's basic needs. The expensive dinners, the jewelry store visits, the cash withdrawals that coincided with his dates with Constance. It all painted a picture of a man who was stealing specifically to fund his affair. But the piece of evidence that would be most devastating to Harold wasn't the financial records. It was the recorded conversations my investigator had captured between Harold and Constance. In those recordings, Harold explicitly discussed his theft from the company, referring to it as taking what I deserve and finally getting paid what I'm worth. In one particularly damning conversation, Harold had told Constance, "Eleanor doesn't need to know about the extra money. She's happy with her simple life, and what she doesn't know won't hurt her. Besides, I've been taking care of her for 37 years. I've earned the right to take care of myself for once." The recordings would prove that Harold's embezzlement wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a calculated decision to steal money he felt entitled to take. They would also reveal the complete contempt he had developed for his wife, whom he clearly saw as an obstacle to his happiness rather than a partner in his life. As Victoria and I finalized the legal strategy, I realized that Harold had made his situation far worse by trying to manipulate me into signing those financial documents. His attempt to gain control of what he thought were Eleanor Blackwood's modest assets would be presented as evidence of his plan to leave me financially helpless after the divorce. "The timing is crucial," Victoria emphasized. "We need Harold to be completely unprepared for what's coming. If he has any advance warning, he might try to flee or dispose of evidence." I nodded, understanding that the success of our plan depended on Harold continuing to believe that Eleanor Blackwood was a naive, trusting woman who had no idea what was happening behind her back. The irony wasn't lost on me that Harold's greatest mistake was underestimating his wife's intelligence. For 37 years, I had been smart enough to maintain a complex double identity that fooled everyone around me. Did Harold really think I wasn't smart enough to figure out that he was cheating and stealing? As I left Victoria's office with copies of the divorce papers that would soon destroy Harold's world, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: a sense of control over my own life. Harold had been so focused on his elaborate schemes with Constance that he'd forgotten the most important rule of deception: always know who you're trying to deceive. In less than a week, Harold would discover that the helpless elderly woman he'd been betraying was actually one of the most powerful people in the state, and there would be absolutely nothing he could do to undo the damage he'd already done to himself. The morning that would shatter Harold's world began like any other Tuesday. He kissed my cheek goodbye at 7:30, grabbed his lunch from the refrigerator, and headed off to Millfield Manufacturing with no idea that this would be the last normal day of his life. I watched from our kitchen window as his blue pickup disappeared around the corner, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Victoria had called the night before to confirm that everything was in place. The criminal charges would be filed at 9 a.m. sharp, with Harold's arrest scheduled for 10:30 at his workplace. The divorce papers, revealing my true identity as Eleanor Montgomery, would be served at the county jail 2 hours later, giving Harold just enough time to process his criminal situation before learning the full scope of his mistake. Remember, Victoria had warned me, once this begins, Harold's world will collapse very quickly. Are you prepared for his reaction when he realizes what he's lost? I was more than prepared. I was eager to see Harold's face when he understood that the simple housewife he'd been betraying was actually the owner of the company he'd been stealing from, the heir to a fortune that dwarfed anything he could have imagined, and the woman who had been smart enough to orchestrate his complete downfall while he thought he was pulling one over on her. At exactly 10:45 a.m., my phone rang. Victoria's voice was tense when I answered. "Eleanor, we have a problem. A big one." My stomach dropped. "What kind of problem?" Harold wasn't at the office when the police arrived to arrest him. According to his supervisor, he called in sick this morning. Something about a stomach bug. They went to your house, but obviously he wasn't there either. I felt the world tilt slightly. Harold had left for work at his usual time. I'd watched him drive away. That's impossible. He left here at 7:30 like always. Eleanor, I need you to think carefully. Has Harold been acting differently the past few days? More suspicious than usual? Any indication he might have suspected something? I mentally reviewed the past week, searching for clues I might have missed. Harold had seemed nervous on Sunday, checking his phone more frequently than usual. On Monday night, he'd made several hushed phone calls from the garage, claiming he was checking on a work project. But these behaviors weren't dramatically different from his recent pattern of secretive communication with Constance. Nothing obvious, I told Victoria. But let me check something. I hung up and immediately called the direct number for Marcus, Reed, my CFO at Montgomery Steel. Marcus answered on the first ring. Mrs. Montgomery, I was just about to call you. We've discovered something disturbing about the Millfield manufacturing situation. What do you mean? The financial irregularities. We've been tracking. They accelerated dramatically over the weekend. Someone with access to Harold Henshaw's login credentials transferred nearly $25,000 from multiple client accounts on Sunday night. It looks like whoever was responsible knew they were running out of time. My blood ran cold. $25,000 was far more than Harold's usual theft amounts. It was the kind of money someone would steal if they were planning to disappear entirely. Marcus, I need you to call Detective Morrison at the county sheriff's office immediately. Tell him that Harold Henshaw may have fled with stolen funds. After I hung up with Marcus, I did something I should have done hours ago. I searched our house thoroughly for any sign of Harold's real activities. What I found in our bedroom made my hands shake with rage and fear. Harold's dresser drawers were mostly empty. His favorite clothes, his important documents, his prescription medications, all gone. In the back of our closet, I discovered that his one good suitcase was missing, along with several items I hadn't noticed were absent. His father's watch, his college ring, a few pieces of jewelry that had sentimental value. But the most damning evidence was what I found hidden under our mattress. A manila envelope containing photocopies of documents that Harold should never have had access to. Somehow, he'd managed to obtain copies of my real social security number, my birth certificate, and several financial statements that were supposed to be secured at Montgomery Steel headquarters. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Harold hadn't just been planning to leave me. He'd been investigating me. Somehow, despite my careful security measures, he'd discovered that Eleanor Blackwood wasn't who she claimed to be. I called Victoria back immediately. He knows, I said without preamble. Harold knows about my real identity. How is that possible? I don't know, but he's gone, and he's taken evidence with him. We need to assume he's been planning this escape for days, maybe weeks. Victoria was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Eleanor, if Harold knows who you really are, this changes everything. He's not just running from embezzlement charges. He's running with the knowledge that he's married to one of the wealthiest women in the state. The next few hours became a blur of phone calls and emergency meetings. Detective Morrison confirmed that Harold's cell phone had been turned off since Monday evening, and his truck had been found abandoned in the parking lot of a bus station 3 counties away. Surveillance footage showed Harold boarding a Greyhound bus heading south, but the trail went cold after that. Constance Wilkins had also vanished. When police went to her apartment, they found it completely cleaned out, with no forwarding address and no indication of where she might have gone. Her landlord said she'd paid her final month's rent in cash on Sunday and claimed she was relocating for a family emergency. The worst part was learning how Harold had discovered my true identity. According to the investigation that followed, Constance hadn't just been manipulating Harold emotionally. She'd been conducting a sophisticated identity theft operation. Using her access to Millfield Manufacturing's employee records, she'd been gradually collecting information about Harold's personal life, including details about his wife that didn't add up. Eleanor Blackwood had no credit history before moving to Millfield Creek 39 years ago. She had no employment records, no educational background, no family connections that could be traced. For someone with Constance's criminal experience, these gaps would have been obvious red flags indicating that Eleanor Blackwood was an assumed identity. Constance had apparently hired a private investigator of her own, someone with fewer scruples than the firm I'd used, to dig deeper into Eleanor's background. When that investigation revealed the truth about Eleanor Montgomery, Constance had seen an opportunity far greater than just seducing a small-town accountant. The plan, as detectives reconstructed it, had been brilliant in its simplicity. Constance would continue her affair with Harold while gradually revealing what she'd learned about his wife's true identity. Harold, faced with the knowledge that he'd been married to a fortune for 37 years without knowing it, would be motivated to steal as much as possible before I discovered his crimes. The $25,000 Harold had taken over, the weekend wasn't just embezzled funds, it was seed money for whatever new life he and Constance had planned together. But more importantly, Harold now possessed information about my financial holdings that he could potentially use for blackmail, identity theft, or other crimes that could damage Montgomery Steel Industries and my family's reputation. As I sat in Detective Morrison's office that Tuesday afternoon, filling out paperwork and answering questions about my missing husband, I realized that Harold's betrayal had evolved into something far more dangerous than a simple midlife crisis affair. Harold wasn't just a cheating husband anymore. He was a fugitive who possessed sensitive information about one of the state's largest privately held companies. He'd transformed from a pathetic man having an affair into a legitimate threat to everything I'd worked to protect. "Mrs. Montgomery," Detective Morrison said gently, "I need you to understand that this case has moved beyond local law enforcement. Given the amounts involved and the potential for ongoing financial crimes, we're bringing in federal investigators. Your husband and his accomplice have committed federal fraud, and they have access to information that could be used for much larger crimes." The irony was devastating. I'd spent months planning the perfect moment to reveal Harold's betrayal and watch his world crumble. Instead, Harold had turned the tables on me completely. He'd stolen my money, learned my secrets, and escaped before I could spring my trap. For the first time in my adult life, Eleanor Montgomery, the woman who had built and maintained a business empire, who had successfully hidden her identity for decades, who had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone around her, had been completely outmaneuvered by a small-town accountant and his con artist girlfriend. Harold was gone. My secrets were compromised, and I had no idea where he was or what he planned to do with the information he'd stolen from me. The student had definitively become the teacher, and I was the one who'd been left holding worthless papers while the real prize disappeared into the night. The 3 weeks that followed Harold's disappearance were the darkest period of my life. I found myself trapped in a nightmare where everything I had built over 7 decades was suddenly at risk because of my own miscalculations. The woman who had successfully managed a business empire while maintaining a secret identity for nearly 4 decades had been completely blindsided by her own husband. The immediate aftermath was a bureaucratic hell that tested every ounce of my strength. Federal agents had seized our house as a potential crime scene, forcing me to move into a hotel while they searched for evidence of Harold's crimes. Watching strangers rifle through our bedroom, photograph our personal belongings, and treat our home like a criminal's lair was more humiliating than anything Harold had done to me personally. Agent Patricia Kellerman, the FBI Financial Crimes specialist assigned to the case, was professional but blunt about my situation. "Mrs. Montgomery, your husband possesses detailed information about your business operations, your personal finances, and your family's holdings. In the wrong hands, this information could be used for everything from stock manipulation to corporate espionage." The worst part was the waiting. Harold and Constance had vanished so completely that even federal resources couldn't locate them. Their bus had been tracked to Atlanta, where the trail went cold. Security footage showed them boarding separate flights to different destinations, suggesting they'd planned their escape with military precision. "They've split up," Agent Kellerman explained during one of our weekly briefings. It's a common strategy for fugitive couples. Harder to track two individuals than a pair traveling together. They could be anywhere, different states, different countries. Constance has contacts from her previous crimes who could be helping them establish new identities. Meanwhile, the damage to my reputation and business was spreading like a cancer. Word had leaked to the financial press that Eleanor Montgomery, the reclusive heiress of Montgomery Steel, had been living under an assumed identity while her husband embezzled funds from her own company. The story was too bizarre and juicy for the media to ignore. "Steel heiress fooled by husband's double life," read the headline in the Wall Street Journal. The article painted me as either a naive woman who'd been completely duped by a small-town con man, or a reckless businesswoman whose poor personal judgment raised questions about her corporate leadership. The board of directors at Montgomery Steel was in crisis mode. Several members were calling for my resignation, arguing that my personal complications had compromised the company's integrity. Stock prices had dropped 12% in 2 weeks as investors worried about the stability of leadership and potential ongoing legal issues. "Eleanor," said board chairman William Harrington during an emergency meeting, "we've supported your unconventional management style for years, but this situation has created unprecedented problems. Shareholders are demanding answers about how the owner of a major corporation could be so completely deceived by her own husband." The attack on my competence was particularly painful because it struck at the core of my identity. For 7 decades, I had prided myself on being smarter, more careful, and more strategic than everyone around me. I had built a fortune through careful planning and meticulous attention to detail. The idea that Harold Henshaw, a man I'd supported and protected for 37 years, had outsmarted me was almost impossible to accept. But the financial implications were even more serious than the personal humiliation. Harold hadn't just stolen money from Millfield Manufacturing, he'd used his access to my personal information to apply for credit cards and loans in Eleanor Blackwood's name. Over the past month, while I'd been focused on his affair with Constance, Harold had been systematically creating financial obligations that I was now responsible for. My accountants discovered that Harold had opened 17 different credit accounts, taken out a second mortgage on our house, and even attempted to establish a line of credit using forged documents that claimed Eleanor Blackwood was a business partner in several Montgomery Steel subsidiaries. The total exposure could be close to $200,000, my chief financial officer Marcus Reed reported during a grim meeting at Montgomery Steel headquarters. "We're disputing every fraudulent transaction, but the process will take months, possibly years, to resolve completely." The psychological toll was devastating. I found myself questioning every decision I'd made over the past 4 decades. Had I been naive to trust Harold? Had I been stupid to maintain my secret identity for so long? Had I created the very conditions that allowed this disaster to unfold? The worst moments came late at night in my sterile hotel room, when I would replay conversations from the past year and recognize clues I should have caught. Harold's questions about my family history that I'd dismissed as idle curiosity, his sudden interest in our financial planning that I'd attributed to age-related anxiety, his comments about my limited understanding of money that I'd written off as typical male condescension. I had been so focused on maintaining Eleanor Blackwood's character that I'd failed to protect Eleanor Montgomery's interests. The very intelligence that had allowed me to build and maintain my double life had somehow made me blind to the threats developing in my own home. The isolation was almost unbearable. For 37 years, Harold had been my closest companion, the person I shared my daily life with even if I couldn't share my deepest secrets. Now I was completely alone, surrounded by lawyers and federal agents who saw me as either a victim or a potential accomplice, but never as a person who was grieving the destruction of her entire world. My longtime friends in the Montgomery social circle didn't know how to handle the scandal. Some offered support, but their sympathy felt tinged with the kind of morbid fascination people have for train wrecks. Others distanced themselves entirely, worried that association with me might damage their own reputations. "Eleanor, darling," said my old friend Margaret Whitfield during one particularly painful lunch, "everyone's talking about how you could have been so careless. I mean, after what happened to your mother with fortune hunters, how could you not have seen this coming?" The comparison to my mother was particularly cruel. My mother had died young, partly due to the stress of managing unwanted attention from men who were only interested in the Montgomery fortune. I had spent my entire adult life trying to avoid her fate, only to end up victimized by someone I'd trusted completely. The legal complications seemed endless. Because Harold had stolen money from a company I owned while living under an identity I'd created, every aspect of the case involved layers of complexity that normal fraud investigations never encountered. Prosecutors weren't sure whether to treat me as a victim, a witness, or a potential co-conspirator who might have known about Harold's activities. "The problem," explained my criminal defense attorney Thomas Brennan, "is that your elaborate deception makes it difficult for prosecutors to believe you didn't know what Harold was doing. A jury might find it hard to accept that someone smart enough to maintain a secret identity for 40 years was completely fooled by her husband's embezzlement." The irony was maddening. My greatest strength, my ability to compartmentalize information and maintain complex deceptions, had become my greatest liability. The skills that had protected me from fortune hunters and gold diggers had been turned against me by the one person I'd trusted with my heart. As I sat in my hotel room on that third Wednesday night, surrounded by legal documents and financial statements, I realized that Harold's betrayal had accomplished something that decades of business challenges and personal setbacks never had. It had made me question my own competence and judgment at the most fundamental level. For the first time in my adult life, Eleanor Montgomery felt truly powerless. Harold had taken my money, my secrets, my dignity, and my confidence. He'd left me exposed to legal prosecution, financial ruin, and public humiliation. Most devastatingly, he'd shattered my belief that I was smart enough to protect myself from the people closest to me. The woman who had once felt invincible now lay awake each night, wondering if she had the strength to rebuild everything Harold had destroyed, or if this disaster would finally prove that even the most careful planning couldn't protect against the ultimate betrayal by someone you love. The turning point came on a cold November morning when I was sitting in yet another sterile conference room, listening to Agent Kellerman explain why the FBI still had no leads on Harold and Constance's whereabouts. As she droned on about international banking regulations and extradition treaties, I found myself staring out the window at the Montgomery Steel headquarters building across the street. The company my grandfather had built, my father had expanded, and I had transformed into a modern industrial empire. "Mrs. Montgomery," Agent Kellerman was saying, "I need you to understand that without cooperation from foreign banking authorities, tracing international wire transfers can take months or even years. Your husband and his accomplice may have moved funds through multiple countries before—" "Stop," I said quietly, cutting her off mid-sentence. Agent Kellerman looked startled. "Excuse me?" I turned away from the window and faced her directly. I said stop. "I'm done listening to explanations about why you can't find two people who stole less money than I spend on office supplies in a single month." For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than despair or self-pity. I felt anger, not the helpless rage I'd been carrying, but the cold, focused fury that had once driven me to build one of the most successful companies in the region. "Agent Kellerman, how much has this investigation cost so far? Federal agents, forensic accountants, international inquiries? What's the taxpayer bill for chasing Harold Henshaw?" She shifted uncomfortably. "I don't see how that's relevant to humor me. Rough estimate. Probably close to $500,000 in resources so far." I stood up and gathered my papers. $500,000 to chase a man who stole 25,000, and you still have nothing to show for it. Mrs. Montgomery, I understand your frustration, but these investigations take time. We have to follow proper procedures. No, I said firmly. You have to follow proper procedures. I don't. That afternoon, I walked into the Montgomery Steel boardroom for the first time since Harold's disappearance. The 11 board members looked uncomfortable as I took my seat at the head of the table, not the deferential posture I'd maintained during recent crisis meetings, but the commanding presence I'd used to run board meetings for the past 15 years. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, I've called this meeting to address several misunderstandings about my situation and this company's future. Board Chairman William Harrington cleared his throat. Eleanor, we've been discussing the possibility of bringing in an interim CEO to handle operations while you deal with your personal— William, I interrupted. You're fired. The room went silent. Harrington's face went through several shades of red before settling on outraged purple. You can't just— I can, and I have. Your replacement is Rebecca Martinez from our Dallas subsidiary. She'll be here Monday morning. I turned to face the rest of the board. Anyone else who thinks my personal complications disqualify me from running the company I own is welcome to submit their resignation immediately. The power shift in the room was immediate and dramatic. These people had spent weeks treating me like a victim, questioning my judgment, and discussing my future as if I weren't present. Now they were reminded that Eleanor Montgomery wasn't just another scandal-plagued executive. She was the woman who controlled their paychecks. Now, I continued, let's discuss how we're going to turn this situation to our advantage. The media attention has been negative, but it's also made Montgomery Steel headline news for the first time in years. We're going to use that visibility to announce the largest expansion in company history. Over the next hour, I laid out a comprehensive plan that would transform the Harold scandal from a liability into a strategic opportunity. We would frame my experience as a cautionary tale about corporate security while simultaneously demonstrating that Montgomery Steel's leadership was strong enough to overcome any personal challenge. We're going to be completely transparent about what happened, I explained. But we're also going to show that a company led by someone who survived this kind of betrayal is stronger and more resilient than our competitors. After the board meeting, I returned to my hotel room and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was done being Eleanor Blackwood. I was done hiding behind a modest lifestyle and pretending to be someone I wasn't. Most importantly, I was done letting Harold Henshaw control my life from whatever tropical beach he was probably enjoying with my money. I called Jennifer Walsh, my longtime assistant, and gave her instructions that she'd been waiting decades to receive. Jennifer, I want you to coordinate with the estate management company. I'm moving back into the Montgomery mansion immediately. Full staff, full security, full everything. And I want my divorce attorney to arrange a press conference. For Friday, a press conference? Jennifer sounded surprised. Are you sure that's wise given the ongoing investigation? The investigation is going nowhere, and I'm tired of letting other people control the narrative. It's time for Eleanor Montgomery to tell her own story. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparation that felt like awakening from a long, terrible dream. For the first time in months, I was making decisions based on my own strategic judgment rather than reacting to other people's crises. My security team, led by former FBI agent Michael Torres, briefed me on protective measures that would make it virtually impossible for Harold to surprise me again, even if he returned to the area. My media consultant, Patricia Stone, helped me craft a message that would reframe the entire scandal as a story of resilience rather than victimization. The key, Patricia explained, is to position you as someone who made a deliberate choice to live modestly, not someone who was deceived about her own life. You weren't Harold's victim. You were conducting an experiment in authentic relationships that he failed. But the most important preparation was psychological. For 37 years, I had submerged Eleanor Montgomery's personality to become Eleanor Blackwood. Now I needed to remember who I really was. Not just the heiress to a fortune, but the woman who had earned the respect of industrial leaders, who had transformed a regional company into a national powerhouse, who had never backed down from a fight when the stakes mattered. On Thursday evening, I stood in the master suite of the Montgomery mansion for the first time in nearly 4 decades. The room was exactly as I'd left it, elegant, spacious, and utterly different from the cramped bedroom I'd shared with Harold on Maple Street. As I looked out at the grounds that stretched to the private lake, I realized that this wasn't just about recovering from Harold's betrayal. This was about reclaiming the life I'd abandoned when I decided to play Eleanor Blackwood. The woman who had built Montgomery Steel hadn't gotten where she was by waiting for other people to solve her problems. She'd gotten there by identifying what she wanted and taking whatever steps were necessary to achieve it. Harold had reminded me of something I'd temporarily forgotten. Eleanor Montgomery didn't just survive challenges, she conquered them. Friday. Morning. I dressed in a custom-tailored suit that cost more than Harold's annual salary and drove to the press conference in a Mercedes that I'd owned for years but never driven. As I walked into the hotel ballroom filled with reporters, I felt the return of something I'd lost during the dark weeks of Harold's disappearance: confidence in my own power. The questions came fast and aggressive, exactly as I'd expected. How could someone so successful be so naive? Did I have any idea where my husband was? Was I concerned about ongoing financial exposure? I answered each question with the kind of directness that had once made Montgomery Steel competitors nervous, about going up against me in contract negotiations. Yes, I had trusted my husband, and that trust had been betrayed. No, I had no idea where Harold was, but I was no longer interested in his whereabouts. Yes, there had been financial complications, but they represented a tiny fraction of my holdings and would be resolved through proper legal channels. But the most important thing to understand, I concluded, is that Harold Henshaw's crimes don't reflect any weakness or failure on my part. They reflect his choice to steal from a woman who had spent 37 years supporting and protecting him. That's his character, not mine. As I left the press conference, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Harold's disappearance: excitement about the future. For the first time in months, I wasn't just reacting to Harold's choices, I was making my own. Eleanor Montgomery was back, and she had scores to settle. The breakthrough came exactly 1 week after my press conference, from a source I never could have anticipated. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my restored office at Montgomery Steel when Jennifer Walsh knocked on my door with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Montgomery, there's someone here to see you. She says it's about Harold and she has information the FBI doesn't have." The woman who walked into my office was petite, nervous, and appeared to be in her early 40s. She clutched a worn leather purse and kept glancing toward the door as if she might need to make a quick escape. "Mrs. Montgomery, my name is Sarah Collins. I was married to David Peterson." The name hit me like a physical blow. David Peterson, Constance's second victim, the insurance executive who'd gone to prison for embezzlement after falling for her schemes. I gestured for Sarah to sit down, my mind racing with the implications of her unexpected visit. "Mrs. Collins, how did you find me?" Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I saw your press conference on the news. When I heard about what happened to you, I knew I had to come forward. Constance Wilkins destroyed my family, and I've been tracking her movements ever since David's trial." Over the next hour, Sarah Collins revealed information that the FBI's sophisticated investigation had completely missed. While federal agents had been checking airports and border crossings, Sarah had been monitoring something much simpler: Constance's psychological patterns. "Constance doesn't just steal money," Sarah explained. "She steals identities, histories, entire lives. But she has one weakness. She can't resist taking trophies from her victims." Sarah opened her purse and pulled out a thick file folder filled with photographs, documents, and printouts. After David went to prison, I became obsessed with understanding how Constance operated. I hired a private investigator to track her activities with her first husband, Robert Fleming, and I discovered something the police missed. The photographs Sarah showed me were stunning in their implications. Constance had kept jewelry, personal items, and photographs from each of her previous victims. More importantly, she'd used social media and online profiles to maintain a twisted form of contact with her victims' families, apparently enjoying the ongoing drama her crimes had created. She creates fake social media accounts to monitor the people she's hurt, Sarah continued. She knows about my children's school activities, my current address, even my new job. It's like she can't let go of the destruction she's caused. But Sarah's most shocking revelation was yet to come. She handed me a printout of a Facebook profile for someone named Constance Parker. Clearly a fake identity, but one that had been posting updates about a romantic getaway in Costa Rica with photographs that unmistakably showed Harold. She posted these pictures 3 days ago, Sarah said. She can't help herself. She wants people to see how well she's living with money she stole. The photographs were devastating evidence of Harold's complete transformation. Gone was the modest, careful man I'd been married to for 37 years. These pictures showed Harold on a luxury yacht, wearing expensive clothes, and flaunting a lifestyle that cost more per day than our former modest monthly budget. But what made the pictures truly infuriating was Harold's expression. He looked happier and more confident than I'd ever seen him. The man who had once lectured me about spending $15 on a throw pillow was now posing with champagne bottles that probably cost more than his former weekly salary. There's more, Sarah said quietly. I've been corresponding with Robert, Fleming's sister, and she's been tracking Constance too. We think we know exactly where they're staying. Sarah pulled out a map of Costa Rica with several locations marked in red ink. Constance always follows the same pattern. She starts with expensive hotels to enjoy the stolen money, but then she moves to more remote locations where she thinks she can't be traced. Based on her previous behavior, she and your husband should be at a villa near Manuel Antonio within the next few days. The precision of Sarah's investigation put the FBI's efforts to shame. While federal agents had been following official procedures and international protocols, this determined woman had been conducting old-fashioned detective work that actually produced results. Mrs. Collins, I said carefully, what exactly are you asking me to do with this information? Sarah looked directly at me for the first time since entering my office. I want justice, not just for you, but for all of us. Constance has been doing this for years, destroying families and walking away without consequences. She's never faced real accountability because her victims are usually too embarrassed or financially devastated to fight back effectively. But you're different, Sarah continued. You have resources that Robert and David and I never had. You can do something that actually matters. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have shocked the woman I'd been just months earlier. Instead of calling Agent Kellerman or working through official channels, I contacted Michael Torres, my security chief, and arranged for a very different kind of operation. Michael, I need you to coordinate with a private security firm that specializes in international recovery operations. I want Harold and Constance located, confronted, and returned to face justice. But I want it done quietly and efficiently, without the bureaucratic delays that have characterized this investigation so far. Michael Torres had spent 15 years with the FBI before joining my security team, and he understood exactly what I was asking for. Mrs. Montgomery, are you sure you want to handle this outside official channels? There could be legal complications. Michael, Harold stole my money, betrayed my trust, and compromised my company's reputation. Constance destroyed multiple families before targeting mine. I'm not interested in legal complications. I'm interested in results. Within 48 hours, Michael had assembled a team of former law enforcement and military personnel who specialized in recovering stolen assets and fugitive tracking. Unlike the FBI's investigation, this operation wouldn't be limited by international jurisdictions, extradition treaties, or bureaucratic procedures. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than attempting to arrest Harold and Constance, officially, the team would locate them, document their location and activities, and then create circumstances that would force them to return voluntarily to face the consequences of their actions. "The key," explained team leader Marcus Webb, a former DEA agent who'd spent years tracking fugitives in Central America, "is making them more afraid of staying in Costa Rica than they are of coming back to face the music in the United States. But my role in the operation wouldn't be passive. I was going to Costa Rica personally to confront Harold and Constance face to face. For 37 years, Harold had seen Eleanor Blackwood as a simple, trusting woman who could be manipulated and deceived. It was time for him to meet Eleanor Montgomery, the woman who had built an industrial empire and wasn't afraid to use every resource at her disposal to protect it. "Mrs. Montgomery," Marcus Webb said during our final planning meeting, "I need you to understand that this confrontation could be dangerous. Harold and Constance are desperate fugitives who've already proven they're willing to commit serious crimes. When you reveal yourself and your resources, they may react unpredictably." I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Marcus, Harold spent 37 years underestimating what I'm capable of. I'm looking forward to showing him exactly how wrong he's been." 3 days later, I boarded my private jet for the flight to Costa Rica. In my briefcase were divorce papers that would strip Harold of any claim to my assets, criminal charges that would send both him and Constance to prison, and enough evidence to destroy any possibility that they could continue their criminal careers. But more importantly, I was carrying something Harold had never seen before: the full force of Eleanor Montgomery's anger, backed by resources he couldn't imagine and a determination that 37 years of betrayal had only made stronger. Harold had wanted to see what his wife was really worth. He was about to find out in ways he'd never anticipated. The villa overlooking the Pacific coastline near Manuel Antonio was exactly where Sarah Collins had predicted it would be. As my security team's surveillance confirmed, Harold and Constance had been living there for the past week, enjoying what they believed was their perfect escape funded by stolen money and hidden truths. I watched them through high-powered binoculars from our observation point on the hillside above their rental property. Harold was lounging by the infinity pool in designer swim trunks, reading what appeared to be investment magazines, while sipping drinks that probably cost more than he used to spend on groceries in a month. Constance lay beside him in a bikini that cost more than most people's monthly rent, occasionally reaching over to touch his arm or whisper something that made him laugh. The transformation was so complete, it was almost unrecognizable. This relaxed, confident man bore no resemblance to the penny-pinching accountant who had once lectured me about turning off lights to save on electricity. Harold had shed his modest small-town persona as completely as I had once shed my wealthy heiress identity, except his transformation was built on crimes against the people who'd trusted him most. "Target confirmed," Marcus Webb reported through our encrypted communication system. "Both subjects are present and appear to be following their established routine. No indication they suspect surveillance." The irony wasn't lost on me that Harold and Constance felt so secure in their tropical paradise that they'd grown careless about their own security. After weeks of careful planning and execution, they'd allowed success to make them overconfident, the same mistake that had ultimately led to their downfall in previous schemes. My approach was carefully orchestrated to maximize psychological impact. Rather than confronting them immediately, I checked into the same resort where they were staying, using my real name and making no attempt to hide my presence. Within hours, the hotel staff was buzzing about their famous guest, Eleanor Montgomery, the steel industry heiress whose husband's disappearance had been international news. The first crack in Harold and Constance's facade appeared that evening at the resort's main restaurant. I had deliberately chosen a table with a clear view of the dining room, wearing an elegant dress that had probably cost more than Harold's entire wardrobe back in Millfield Creek. When Harold and Constance entered for their dinner reservation, I watched Harold's face drain of color as he recognized me across the crowded room. The woman who'd been laughing and flirting with him just moments earlier suddenly looked confused as Harold grabbed her arm and whispered urgently in her ear. I could see Constance's expression change from confusion to alarm as she processed what Harold was telling her. The relaxed confidence that had characterized their body language all week evaporated in seconds. They didn't approach my table, of course. Instead, they huddled together in urgent conversation, occasionally glancing in my direction with expressions that ranged from disbelief to terror. I calmly continued my dinner, occasionally nodding politely when our eyes met, as if running into my fugitive husband in a Costa Rican resort was the most natural thing in the world. After 20 minutes of whispered arguments, Harold finally stood up and walked toward my table. The man approaching me looked nothing like the confident resort guest I'd been observing all day. This was Harold Henshaw at his most desperate, the same expression he'd worn during our worst arguments, except magnified by the knowledge that his entire fantasy world was about to collapse. "Eleanor," he said quietly, standing beside my table but not sitting down. "What are you doing here?" I looked up from my seafood course and smiled pleasantly. "Hello, Harold. I could ask you the same question, but I suppose I already know the answer. You're enjoying the fruits of your embezzlement in a country without extradition treaties. How refreshing to see you being honest about your priorities for once." Harold's voice dropped to an urgent whisper. "Eleanor, listen to me. This isn't what it looks like. I can explain everything." "Oh, I'm sure you can," I replied, taking another bite of my dinner. "I imagine you have quite a story prepared about how stealing from your wife's company and fleeing the country with your mistress was actually an act of love or loyalty. Please, sit down and share it with me." Harold glanced back at Constance, who was watching our interaction with obvious panic, then reluctantly took the chair across from me. "Eleanor, I know you're angry, but if you'll just listen—" "Actually, Harold, I'm not angry anymore," I interrupted. "I was angry for a while, especially when I realized you'd been investigating my background and planning this elaborate scheme for months. But anger is an emotion you feel toward people who matter to you. You don't matter to me anymore." The words hit Harold like physical blows. For 37 years, he'd been the center of Eleanor Blackwood's universe, the man she depended on for everything from financial security to social identity. The idea that Eleanor Montgomery might feel complete indifference toward him was clearly more devastating than anger would have been. "Eleanor, please, we can work this out. I know I made mistakes, but we can start over. I realize now how much Harold," I said gently, "look around you. Really look." Harold's eyes followed my gesture, taking in the elegant restaurant, the wealthy international clientele, the staff who were treating me with the deference reserved for their most important guests. "This is who I really am," I continued. "This resort, this lifestyle, these resources, this is my normal world. The little house on Maple Street, the careful budgeting, the modest lifestyle you thought we shared. That was all an elaborate performance I maintained for your benefit." Harold's face went through several expressions as the full implications sank in. "You mean, you've always been one of the wealthiest women in the country?" "Yes, Harold. The company you've been stealing from? I own it. The FBI agents tracking. You? I'm coordinating with them. The private security team that located you here? I hired them. The divorce papers you'll be served tomorrow? They'll strip you of any claim to assets you never knew I had in the first place." The psychological destruction was immediate and complete. Harold had built his entire scheme around the belief that he was outsmarting a simple housewife and escaping to a better life with a sophisticated younger woman. learning that his simple wife was actually the powerful executive he'd spent years resenting, and that his sophisticated girlfriend was a career criminal who'd destroyed multiple families, shattered every assumption that had driven his betrayal. But, most importantly, Harold, I continued, I want you to understand that this confrontation isn't about revenge. It's about justice. Not just for me, but for Sarah Collins, whose husband went to prison because of Constance's schemes. For Robert Fleming's family, who lost everything to her manipulation. For all the victims who never had the resources to fight back. Harold's voice was barely audible when he spoke. What happens now? I signaled to Marcus Webb, who was seated discreetly across the restaurant with 2 members of our security team. Now, you and Constance have a choice. You can return to the United States voluntarily to face the criminal charges waiting for you, or you can try to continue running from a woman who has unlimited resources and very good reasons to ensure you face justice. As Marcus approached our table, Harold finally understood that this wasn't a negotiation or an opportunity for reconciliation. This was Eleanor Montgomery serving notice that his crime spree was over and his reckoning had begun. The plane leaves tomorrow morning, I told Harold as Marcus placed a firm hand on his shoulder. I suggest you spend tonight deciding whether you want to face your consequences with whatever dignity you have left, or whether you'd prefer to be dragged back to face them. The man who had once believed he was cleverly escaping from his boring life with his naive wife now realized he had actually stolen from one of the most powerful women in the country and betrayed someone who had spent decades protecting him from consequences he'd never imagined. Harold's fantasy was over, and Eleanor Montgomery's justice was just beginning. 6 months after Harold and Constance were extradited back to the United States, I stood in the same courtroom where their sentencing had just concluded. Harold received 8 years in federal prison for embezzlement, fraud, and money laundering. Constance, with her extensive criminal history, was sentenced to 12 years for operating a criminal enterprise that had defrauded multiple victims across several states. As I watched Harold being led away in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction in his destruction, but rather a profound sense of closure. The man who had once dismissed me as intellectually inferior and emotionally dependent was now facing nearly a decade in prison for crimes against the woman he'd never bothered to understand. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive once. Harold and Constance returned to face charges. Harold's recorded conversations about his thefts, combined with Constance's pattern of similar crimes against other victims, made prosecution straightforward. More importantly, the case had established legal precedents that would make it easier for future victims of such schemes to seek justice. Sarah Collins had been in the courtroom for the sentencing, along with Robert Fleming and several other victims of Constance's previous schemes. For the first time in years, these people saw their experiences validated by a justice system that often overlooks white-collar crimes against individuals. "Mrs. Montgomery," Sarah said to me after the proceedings concluded, "I can't thank you enough for what you've done, not just for yourself, but for all of us. David and I may never recover financially from what Constance did to our family, but seeing her finally face real consequences gives us some peace." The financial recovery had been more complete than anyone had expected. Harold and Constance had been living extravagantly, but they hadn't had time to dispose of most of the stolen funds. Nearly 90% of the money was recovered and returned to its rightful accounts. The remaining losses were so small compared to Montgomery Steel's overall holdings that they barely registered as a rounding error in our quarterly reports. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the restoration of my reputation and the validation of my business judgment. The media narrative had shifted completely from wealthy heiress fooled by husband to business leader who outmaneuvered international criminals. My handling of the crisis had actually enhanced my standing in the business community. The Montgomery Steel board, with its new leadership, had rallied behind my crisis management and used the publicity to launch the most successful expansion in company history. Our transparency about the security vulnerabilities that had enabled Harold's crimes combined with the comprehensive reforms we'd implemented, had actually increased investor confidence in our corporate governance. "Eleanor," said Rebecca Martinez, Harold's replacement as chairman, during our quarterly board meeting, "I've never seen a company turn a crisis into a competitive advantage as effectively as we have. Our stock price is higher than it was before any of this began, and we're getting acquisition inquiries from companies that want to partner with leadership that can handle anything." The personal transformation had been even more profound than the business recovery. After 37 years of hiding my true self, I had rediscovered the confidence and decisiveness that had built Montgomery Steel into an industry leader. I was no longer willing to diminish myself for anyone's comfort, and I'd stopped apologizing for the success that Harold had secretly resented. I'd moved permanently back into the Montgomery mansion, finally living in a style that reflected my actual circumstances rather than a character I'd been playing. The staff, led by Mrs. Patricia Holloway, had welcomed me back with relief and genuine warmth. "Ma'am," Mrs. Holloway had said during my first week back, "if you don't mind me saying, you seem more like yourself than you have in decades. That awful little house was never worthy of you." The social adjustments had been surprisingly smooth. My old friends in the Montgomery social circle had been initially shocked by the revelations about my double life, but most had ultimately been impressed by my ability to maintain such an elaborate deception for so long. If anything, my mystique had been enhanced by the discovery that I'd been even more interesting than anyone had suspected. "Darling," my friend Margaret Whitfield had said at a charity gala just last month, "I have to admit, knowing that you were living in that dreadful little town while owning half the state makes you infinitely more fascinating than if you'd just been another boring heiress." The romantic aspects of my future remained an open question. At 72, I wasn't looking for another husband, but I'd discovered that financial independence and personal authenticity made me infinitely more attractive to the kind of sophisticated men I'd once moved among. Several distinguished gentlemen had expressed interest in my company, though I was taking that aspect of my life very slowly. More importantly, I'd learned that I didn't need a romantic partner to feel complete. The years I'd spent hiding my true self to make Harold comfortable had taught me that no relationship was worth sacrificing your authentic identity. If I ever became involved with someone again, it would be as Eleanor Montgomery, not as some diminished version of myself designed to protect someone else's ego. The business implications of my experience had led to broader changes as well. Montgomery Steel had implemented comprehensive background check procedures and financial monitoring systems that made Harold's type of embezzlement virtually impossible. We'd also established a foundation dedicated to helping victims of financial fraud, particularly cases involving romantic manipulation like Constance's schemes. The Eleanor Montgomery Foundation for Financial Justice had already helped 12 families recover stolen assets and had provided legal support for prosecuting similar crimes. Sarah Collins had become our first client advocate, using her experience to help other victims navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of seeking justice. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the resolution was the recognition that my ordeal had actually made me a better leader and a stronger person. The crisis had forced me to reconnect with capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed, and had reminded me that challenges were opportunities for growth rather than obstacles to be endured. The woman who had once hidden her intelligence and success to maintain a marriage was now unapologetically brilliant and wealthy, using both qualities to improve the world around her. Harold had intended to diminish and abandon me. Instead, his betrayal had freed me to become more fully myself than I'd been in decades. On quiet evenings in my study at the Montgomery Mansion, I sometimes reflected on the irony that Harold's greatest act of betrayal had become the catalyst for my greatest personal liberation. He'd wanted to escape from Eleanor Blackwood to find a more exciting life with a more sophisticated woman. In the end, he'd actually freed Eleanor Montgomery to reclaim the sophisticated, exciting life she'd temporarily set aside for love. The final piece of justice had come just last week when I received word that Constance had been placed in solitary confinement after attempting to manipulate a prison guard into smuggling contraband for her. Even in prison, she couldn't resist trying to run her old schemes. Some people, it seemed, never learned. Harold, according to reports from his prison counselor, had become a model inmate who spent most of his time in the library reading business magazines and financial newspapers. Perhaps he was finally trying to understand the world he'd never bothered to learn about while he was married to someone who'd mastered it decades ago. As for me, I woke up each morning in my beautiful home, ran a company I loved, and lived exactly the life I'd earned through intelligence, hard work, and careful planning. I was surrounded by people who respected my achievements, valued my judgment, and appreciated my authentic self. Harold had thrown away 37 years of love, loyalty, and protection from a woman who could have given him everything he'd ever dreamed of. Instead, he'd chosen temporary excitement with a criminal who'd destroyed his life as thoroughly as she'd destroyed her previous victims. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, and Eleanor Montgomery was living very well indeed. Up. Next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.